Yet. I'm Lindsay. I'm the new communications coordinator for the NHA, so I'm very excited to be here and to be presenting our special guest today. Thank you so much for coming to another exciting Food for Thought at the Whaling Museum. If you haven't already, if you could please silence your cell phones as not to disrupt the presentation. And thank you very much for supporting this free community program, which is supported in part by a grant from the Nantucket Cultural Council, local agency that's supported by the Massachusetts Cultural Council, a state agency. The following guest, it seems like, really needs no introduction, as he's been a staple on Nantucket for almost 30 years, and apparently many of you are patients of his, so you're very familiar with our guest today. The book Island Practice captures his stories of practicing medicine on Nantucket. So please, everybody, help us welcome Dr. Tim Lepore.
Thank you very much. I hope you all sign in, because people that aren't signed in will not be getting appointments. Now, I was asked to talk about my practice and about the book. And I wanted to say, you know, guys, I'm still alive. I'm not going anywhere. It's a little difficult to call it a retrospective yet. But I thought it would be interesting to review some of the things about the book, some of the things about my experiences in the medical community. You will see my title. I am follically challenged, but I have to shave it, so not deficient. I would like to sort of, this is why I'm challenged. I want to get back at some of the people that have parodied me over the years. This is Joel Ives from St. Paul's. To be parodied by a minister on Halloween, I thought was a little cruel. The hospital decided that that was me, so I like to acknowledge these jibes. Some of you may remember all of these people. I've had wonderful, wonderful employees. Over the years, I've had many employees. Now, that's the number of people I've had. It's sort of like the Stop and Shop, except I don't pay time and a half on weekends. But it is 30 years worth. I've had some mother-daughter teams. I've had some family members, my son and my daughter. But I've had some wonderful people that have made my practice successful. You always hear the story about the street angel and the house devil. They do tend to mellow me out. As you will notice, there are only two men, Charlie Lou Craft and Duncan McDonald. Duncan has moved to the hospital, so he is now anathema, cast out into the darkness, but that's all we can say. The other person is my wife. She is an angel. She worked for me briefly. She was smart enough to leave me and go to the school, where she was school nurse for 14 years and now is a guidance counselor. My daughter-in-law had her gallbladder out 2 days ago, so my wife is out in the western part of the state taking care of her because she's got 2 kids, and my son is a OBGYN resident, so he's always in the hospital. So that's the picture I could use of her. I don't know if she'd be that fond of it now. Now, this is Pam Bellick. Pam Bellick is a very accomplished writer and a reporter. She's a reporter for the New York Times. She's worked for a number of major newspapers, and she was the New England bureau chief. And the Times said, why don't you write an article about somebody interesting? Now, that's always a loaded job. And I'm here to reveal to you some of the unvarnished truth. Now, it's unfortunate and humbling, but as she looked on her choices, she came down to three choices. And you will see my competition. Okay? What can I say? The Bare Naked Mainers Bowling League. Okay. You can't make a video of it, and I'm not sure about a dust jacket for a book. It's not going to go. The next choice was somebody in Vermont that had a movement for Vermont to secede. Now, I think this was settled about 150 years ago. So she finally came across something I had written for an alumni newsletter. And it was funny, but you see my competition. It was a win. She picked me, but the hurdles were exceptionally low. Now, it wasn't because I'm handsome, and it wasn't because of my athletic prowess, which, like my hair, has become a thing of the past. No, it was a quirky alumni report from a college biology major who almost flunked creative writing. Who knew? Well, Pam called me and proposed coming out to visit me and write an article. And this being the middle of the summer, I was being very ADD-ish between tick disease, surgery, the emergency room. I said, why not? So she came out with a photographer and followed me around for several days. Whether I was working in the office and in the emergency room, whether I was running or out collecting bugs, because I was on a big kick to find tularemia in greenhead flies. So I was out in Pulpus with greenhead fly traps. And so the result was an article in the Times. Now, it seemed to be well received, perhaps because it was quirky and crazy, and people were wondering about this guy that was a surgeon out here, the only surgeon, and 30 miles is 30 miles, and when the weather's bad, the weather's bad. But it's not quite being in Nome, Alaska. But in an era of managed care where you get Dr. Generic, it seemed to interest people. And she was approached by some people that said, well, why don't you do a book? So I discussed this with Kathy and with Pam, always Kathy. And I said, yeah, I think we decided it'd be a good idea. Now, my idea of this book, I will tell you honestly, was a statement about modern healthcare, the inequalities. It was going to be a Jeremiah, a call to arms. Fortunately, Pam had a very different vision, and something that would be somewhat less sleep-inducing. So off we went with visits and phone calls over the next several years. And this was the result. Pam followed me in my practice. She asked how medicine worked out here. She talked to patients. I would always ask patients if they wanted to talk to her, and an awful lot of people did, but some people didn't. And Pam spent an awful lot of time reflecting, bouncing it off myself and bouncing it off Kathy to see if what she was writing was really catching the flavor of the island. Now, one question I've been asked is why? Why would I do this? Why would I open up my life, what I do, and why would I sort of expose everything good, bad, and indifferent? Well, I think it's an interesting story. And I recognize that I stand on the shoulders of giants, my parents, my grandparents in particular, as well as the many people who've helped and mentored me throughout my career, who helped me in creative writing. Really, if I stop and consider that my paternal grandfather came to this country in 1890, and was listed on the manifest, obviously steerage, as a peasant. And my grandmother came to this country having been apprenticed to a count in Sweden. They had really gutsy stories. My father was overseas for a number of years through the Tunisian campaign and the Italian campaign up to Cassino. They had the death of a child. They were adolescents through the Depression. I mean, those are real stories, but my story pales next to those, but I think it's sort of interesting. And I also thought it'd be interesting to do a story about the island that A, didn't involve whaling, with all due respect, and didn't involve picadillos of the rich and famous. It sort of sticks in my craw when you see Nantucket mentioned, and it's some banana that's out here for 2 weeks that gets into trouble. I think there's an awful lot that's gone on that is of value and is interesting. I think also maybe it gives a snapshot of a rapidly passing era in medical care. And finally, I thought, you know, when I go to my eternal reward, hopefully, there will be something better than a brass plaque, which I have seen the hospital lose, or put in a men's room. Now, my book is that reminder. It may be in the remainder bin, but it's better than the plaque they lose. Now, in thinking about the island and think about this approach, I said The Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens. I'm going to use that as an outline. Now, you're probably wondering, did I really pass up lunch for this? Okay. There's no Bob Cratchit, and there's no Tiny Tim, but we'll get to that. There's not even a ghost, so there's going to be no baleful sound effects, no chains rattling, and no dire predictions. My story begins in 1979. That's a year when a friend of mine, Paul Thompson, who is a marathon runner like myself, except he's much better. He was 16th in 1976. He had the good fortune to take care of Sam Jones. Now, Sam Jones, some of you may remember, was married to Nancy Jones. Nancy Jones was the administrative secretary at the hospital. So Paul took care of him, and very serendipitously, Nancy said, Paul, why don't you come out and cover the emergency room in the month of August? Paul, always looking for something like that, said, sure. Well, when I heard he was out here, I had only been out here once for a couple of days with an old girlfriend. My wife and I came out to visit him. We stayed at the center board. It looked like a swell vacation. You know, working in the emergency room, I did that a lot in Providence. I ran the emergency room at Roger Williams Hospital. So there wasn't anything particularly unnerving about working in an emergency room out here. So I went to Nancy and I asked her what the chances were. She said 0. Okay. But I'm never one to sort of take no for an answer. So I kept after her. So finally she said yes. So for a couple of years in a row, I came out and worked the month of August. We were on 24, off 48, but we got paid, and that was, it was an interesting time. I also came out to run some of the 10-mile races that we used to have out here. Well, in 1982, Kathy and I were on the boat back to Providence and Roger Williams Hospital, and we said to each other, how come we're going back? This seems pretty nice. So we thought it over, and we had had some expressions of interest from the hospital, because Dr. Mahoney, who had been the previous surgeon, Earl, was re-retiring. He had retired from Strong Memorial. He was one of the real fathers of vascular surgery, retired out here, and then re-retired. So I went to Brown, and I went to Brown University, where I was on the faculty. They make mistakes, just like Harvard did. And told them that we were planning on leaving. Well, this was crickets. Nobody said anything, because they didn't believe me. Now, I was a little bothered that these words went unheard. I mean, I ran the emergency room. I was in charge of the surgical side of the ICU. I had medical students, I had residents, I had PAs. I sort of considered myself a rising star in the surgical firmament. I was an assistant professor. You know, I really, like Marlon Brando on the waterfront, I could have been a contender, okay? Then right after Christmas of 1982, all of a sudden, I get called by the chief of medicine and the chief of surgery at Brown. They said, Tim, what are you doing? What are you thinking about your future? How can I move to this desolate rock, away from the hubbub of academic surgery? How could I do it? Was I crazy? I had dire predictions of boredom and isolation. This is going to be a professional disaster. They counseled me. They cajoled me. They did everything. But if only I would change my ways and return to the bosom of academic surgery, if only I would heed the admonitions of my elders. Now, this was really Marley, okay, laying out this grim future. You know, it was a warning to amend my ways and be cast out of the club. Now, I got to tell you, my parents were not particularly thrilled. Either were my in-laws. My parents, my dad was a surgeon and grew up in Marlborough, Mass., practiced in Marlborough, Mass., played semi-pro football in Marlborough, Mass., and I didn't go in to practice with him for a reason, because we would have driven each other crazy. The first time I covered for him, we had a gentleman with a perforated ulcer in the emergency room, and they asked for the real Dr. Lepore. Okay? That grates a little, so I didn't go into practice with him. I was in Providence, but they weren't quite sure that their son, who was difficult growing up, was leaving this established position at Brown and moving to the hinterlands. But being a little bit thick-headed, we left the morning of January 1st, 1983, and as we pulled out, we were treated to the sight of a young man who had stolen a radio out of a car. He was being chased by cops right across my lawn, almost ran my wife over, and it was sort of a Robert Frost moment. And with a nod to Robert Frost, long I stood, and then I watched the thief run away, and you know what? I knew which path I was going to go on. So on a cold and sunny day, Kathy, Meredith, and I, our son TJ was age 3 and Nick was 10 months. With 2 dogs, we arrived on the island. You know what? They put us up on Main Street. Huh? Pretty ritzy address, okay? You know, we're living high in the hog right here. Sally and Ed Hudzik, who were friends of ours we had met, Sally prepared a big meal for the kid, took the kids so we could unpack, made a big meal. We were really doing well. Then that night, I got called. Could I come and put in a temporary pacemaker? Well, this is my introduction to medicine on Nantucket, island practice. Now, I'm not a cardiologist. Don't play one on TV. But this guy had a heart rate in the 30s, and this was not looking good. So something had to be done. So I went into the hospital and got on the phone. And who did I call? My friend Paul Thompson. So I was visiting some grief back on him, the fellow that had enticed me out here originally. Now, Paul is a real cardiologist. He's currently chief of cardiology at Hartford Hospital. So we talked about it. I didn't have any problem with putting in the line, putting in the pacemaker. It was programming the thing. And this I found slightly daunting, but I just left the phone in my ear as I played with the dials. I didn't tell the patient this. But by hook and by crook, I got it in, and welcome to Nantucket. Very soon, I realized I wasn't in Kansas anymore. This was a different situation. Now, when I was at Roger Williams Hospital in Providence, this is a major hospital, a couple of hundred beds, medical students, residents, attendings, cardiologists, specialists for your right lung, specialists for your left lung, and, you know, all of a sudden, you've been tagged and you're it. At that time, the hospital had 55 beds. So I'm not sure my coming here has been a big plus, as we're down to 19. But some of the patients were in here for a year at a time, so it really wasn't what we envision medicine as today. Administrator was Paul McNamara. Paul was one of those interesting fellows that was administrator and then came back as administrator in the middle of several other administrators. And his secretary, Nancy Jones. There's the director of nurses and her secretary, and the maintenance division was 2 people. I don't want to tell you, but our administration and maintenance, et cetera, has exploded several times, mostly in response to unrealistic demands from state and federal government, but they did very, very well. The medical staff at that time was Dr. Rosen, Dr. Butterworth, Dr. Voorhees, Dr. Briggs, and Dr. Mahoney. Everybody would cover the emergency room 24 hours, and except for Dr. Mahoney. And in truth, at that time, this is me with hair, and Dr. Sequist, who was a radiologist at that time, who had a tremendous painting that unfortunately he took when he left. It showed a skeleton grabbing this young woman, and it was a great medical metaphor. But this, we had x-ray, we didn't have ultrasound, we didn't have CAT scanners. As a matter of fact, there was only 1 CAT scanner at that time in the state of Rhode Island. This was under the approach that you needed a certificate of need, it was going to control costs. The trouble is, you would end up driving from all over Rhode Island to get a CAT scanner in your patient down at St. Joe's, and it was not workable, and then the dike opened. There was no MRI. MRIs really hadn't even been invented then. Billing, which is of interest, as some of you may have received bills recently from the hospital, billing was done on cards. I always thought that this was a little bit primitive, to see people with a shoebox full of cards figuring out who owed what, but it seemed to work. We would get calls in the emergency room at that time about sick seagulls. Somebody once called me very concerned about a rabbit in their yard with pink eyes. Now, this was not a pet rabbit. This was a wild rabbit, and it had pink eyes, and I don't think I was particularly helpful with that. It has not happened to me, but somebody has brought a deer in that was hit. Now, just so that you feel good, the feel-good part of this is the deer was just knocked out. The deer did regain consciousness in the back of the car, and much merriment ensued in the emergency room parking lot. Fortunately, they did not get Bambi into the hospital. At that time, if we had a patient we had to transport, it was taking the seats out of a Cessna 402. Now, a Cessna 402, when you've got regular passengers in there, doesn't seem that bad. But if you take the seats out, you're trying to ventilate the patient, you've got monitors, it's not a whole lot of fun. The other thing is, to get a patient into a Cessna 402 on a stretcher, you have to lift them in sideways. Now, if you have the misfortune of having a patient that is short for their height, or heavy for their height, like 5'2" and 250, you have to strap them onto the stretcher, and it gets a little unwieldy. So transport off island was not particularly common at that time. And really, if you look at it overall, there wasn't that much, even in the early 80s, that was offered off island that wasn't available here. If you had a heart attack back then, basically it was getting you to survive and then talk about doing a CABG. Nobody was doing percutaneous interventions. And so you gave people oxygen, gave them some morphine, and hope they got better. Surgery in those days, and now I'm talking pre-laparoscopic, okay? Laparoscopy is a wonderful invention of the devil. All surgery was open. As I mentioned, Dr. Mahoney was here, He was one of the fathers of vascular surgery, but he was retiring. And so it was Dr. Voorhees and myself. Surgery was all open, which is the way God intended it, in my perspective. Now, when we heard about laparoscopic gallbladders being done, and this was about 1987, I said, that's a nice trick. Doesn't mean much. You don't want to see my picks for the NCAA tournament. I'm a little bit like Thomas Watson, who apocryphally at IBM said there'd only be a need for 5 computers in the world. It probably isn't really true, but it does make a good story, and I thought laparoscopy was a fad. So doing open surgery, which is what I'd done all my career, was not any problem. Anesthesia was done by certified nurse anesthetists. We still have certified nurse anesthetists. They're excellent, never had a problem with it. Any problems we've had have been with anesthesiologists, probably because docs know too much and don't look hard enough. But that's a whole other story. Now, my office at that time was where the ophthalmology office was. It's 2 rooms. One room Nancy Norton sat in, she was my secretary, and I was in the other room. It was medicine at a bare bones. I think the trustees probably felt I was going to leave, and they didn't want to get too attached to me. One of my early acquisitions was a large stuffed cod, which my wife and Nancy threw away on me, and I still resent and look around down in the basement of the hospital. I would see occasional patients, but I was sort of mainly focused on the ER, but then I started seeing more and more patients. And as I got busier, I wasn't able to run as frequently as I used to. So this probably counts for why I'm towards the back of the pack on Monday. My first real surgical case, he was 2 weeks into my tenure here, and it was a surgical catastrophe. It was a catastrophe anywhere. It was a major bowel resection, needed a lot of blood, all kinds of problems. When I finished the case, I said, okay, let's put the patient on the ventilator overnight. No ventilator. Well, this changed quickly as I raised a certain amount of hostility among administrators to go purchase a ventilator very quickly. And almost as quickly, the Lepore's were moved off Main Street. Okay? Now we're in somewhat less elegant digs. If you come down Prospect Street and your brakes fail, at that time you would be in my front yard. The Lima Cottage was actually very nice. We had 2 adults, 3 kids, and 2 dogs. It was cozy, but it was close to the hospital, which was always nice. One of my dogs, we moved to Windy Hill subsequently, but one of my dogs got some rats that first day. Now, it's been said that anatomy is destiny. Well, in my case, geography has been destiny for me. In my professional career, whether at Roger Williams or in Nantucket, I've been very close to the hospital. In 1978, which was around Christmas, was the big fire at Providence College. I lived about 20 feet from the hospital, and they called me. I was the first physician there, and I had an emergency room full of girls that were burned or dying or jumped. And I think that's probably why the hospital put me in charge of the emergency room, because I didn't panic and I handled things pretty well until the cowboys arrived, or the cavalry arrived about a half hour later. On Nantucket, I've always lived in close proximity to the hospital. Now, the Lima Cottage is pretty close, and it's always allowed me to be the first one there. So if you're first one there, you sort of get to control the show. And over time, the hospital sort of realized this. I kept showing up, so they started giving me more titles. And I sort of ended up like Georgy Zhukov. He won Stalingrad, Kursk, and World War II. I was close to the hospital, and I took care of stab wounds of the heart and got a good reputation for it. They just kept giving me titles. I was a very big fish in a very small pond. At this time, I expanded my surgical spectrum. We were doing appendectomies, hernias, gallbladders open God's way, hysterectomies, colon cancer, breast cancer, varicose vein surgery, also surgery. A lot of this changed. It's a change because in some circumstances we understand better approaches to the disease. Certainly with cholecystectomies, laparoscopic does have an advantage, as much as I hate to admit it. Hernia surgery, I think laparoscopic is a reach, but it's accepted. Appendectomies, if you're an 18-year-old girl and you don't want a scar, good. If you're a hairy 40-year-old guy, it really rankles me a little bit to get it done laparoscopically, but that's, who's to know? Breast cancer surgery. Breast cancer surgery has changed tremendously over the years. When I trained, we did the Halsted mastectomy. Halsted mastectomy was a radical mastectomy. It was a great operation that Dr. Halsted down at Johns Hopkins created, but he created for tumors the size of oranges. Now, dealing with tumors of a centimeter, it's really unnecessary. And so it's all changed, and rightly so. The hospital does not have nuclear medicine, so we can't do the techniques you need to do called sentinel node biopsy. So that surgery has sort of gone north, but appropriately so. If we can't do as good as Boston or as cutting edge as Boston, then we shouldn't do it here. Also surgery with modern drugs has gone away, unfortunately, because I did do a nice gastrectomy. But, I can't say that I miss it, but the patients don't. I think other things that we saw through those years, cardiac stab wound of the heart. I looked like a champ. The patient wasn't going to go anywhere. I had always liked thoracic surgery. I almost went into it, so I knew how to fix it. I mean, the first stab wound of the heart was fixed was 1896, and the hospital did not have cardiac sutures. The hospital did not have cardiac pledgets, but they also didn't have those in 1896, so I said, hey, you know what, give me some black silk, and we'll see how it goes. The patient with that stab wound does beat me in races, so. Pheochromocytoma, it was a tragic story. A young woman with a pheochromocytoma, she died of it, undiagnosed. I had never seen a pheochromocytoma outside of a major medical center. I mean, you just don't see them. They're rare tumors of the adrenal gland. This was diagnosed at autopsy, unfortunately, but in the retrospectoscope, we couldn't have done anything differently. Medullary cancer of the thyroid. First thyroid nodule I referred off island turned out to be a medullary cancer of the thyroid, which is the third less common cancer of the thyroid. Who knew? We get a variety of odd things in odd places. We won't show those because they may be your friends and neighbors. We got a lot of trauma, motor vehicle accidents, mopeds and bikes, cuts, amputations. I was actually considering opening up a business with gloves with 4 fingers, but some people didn't appreciate that humor. Fractures, poison ivy, tick bites. There's very little interpersonal violence. While I think in the summer most people are drunk after 10 in the morning, lawyers do not usually go after stockbrokers, so at least not with weapons. The things like this, an altercation where an ear got bitten off, they didn't bring in the ear, so I had to sort of put it together. This was a fish bone that a gentleman had swallowed, and it had worked its way almost all the way out. He thought he had a perirectal abscess, but he didn't. And the only thing worse than finding a worm in your apple is finding half a worm. So we have had patients come in with, this is a small one. I do have at home pictures of about an 18-inch tapeworm that a matron from the better addresses in Connecticut brought in. It was only half of it, though. Now, at this time, the hospital relented. They said, hey, you know what, the guy's going to stay. So they moved me to a bigger office. I had 2 rooms, but there was a room in back. And I was feeling feisty at that point, sort of a Patrick Henry moment. And I said, you know what, I'm going to sell bait out of the back room. Well, the hospital didn't like that idea. And so I didn't end up doing that. I thought it was a good idea. But then they made the mistake of every now and then we rotate the presidency of the medical staff, you rotate onto the Board of Trustees, which is always a problem for me. I don't do well with authority. They had made a decision I objected to, so I made a motion to impeach the executive committee. Not a big surprise, but it didn't carry. Now, it was at about this time that I got involved in tick research. And again, it was serendipity. When I had worked out here in the summer, I thought it was sort of cute that they had these signs up about babesia. And, you know, Lyme disease was still really not being associated with it. And I got interested, and I met some great guys. I had seen the signs these hokey signs that they'd put up. An investigation of babesiosis is underway. It's usually a mild disease. That's always a mistake to say. Made the New York Times. And this was the notice called Nantucket fever. It was cute, was in the New England Journal. Everybody thought it was sort of funny. Pictures of it. However, the 5th patient to have babesia was not as amused. She did not consider it a mild disease. She got quite sick, and she wrote this nastygram to the powers that be through the Inky Mirror, which I always thought was very interesting. But then I met Andy Spielman. Andy was the guy that originally found babesia out here. There had been a couple of cases, and the Harvard School of Public Health dispatched Andy, who was primarily a mosquito guy. He was an entomologist out here. He arrived with data from the 30s and 40s showing there was primarily mouse ticks out here. And he had that expectation. When he got here, found a totally new tick, the deer tick, and found they infected the mice, put the whole cycle together for babesia very quickly. He was aided by Gus Damon, Nantucket guy. Gus was a world-class pathologist, very interested in infectious diseases, and Gus was also one of the big hitters in this. I did not really recognize Gus's CV until I really looked it up. Seemed like a nice guy to me, did not seem like one of the giants that he really was. Very involved in typhus and all of that through the Second World War. And a third person was down here on the lower right-hand side, Sam Telford, who is now at the Tufts Veterinary School and serves as a resource for me for obscuro diseases or things I can't explain in patients on Nantucket. Rashes, love them. All kinds of interesting things. I like to use people always like rashes. They don't always have to be a bullseye. You just got to be suspicious. And if you're suspicious and you're cautious, you're right more than you're wrong. Particularly on Nantucket. because we have our own spectrum of diseases, which I have to beat into the people who work in the emergency room repeatedly. And then, so that was Babesia and Lyme. Then I got very interested in this disease called anaplasma, or Ehrlichia. And this is a very roundabout way. It could only happen in Nantucket. Sam Telford came to me and said, you know, we're going to get the blood from the heartworm studies of the dogs, and we're going to look for this particular disease called anaplasma. Well, you know, we found it in the dogs. Okay. At that time, we had the health fair, and we probably would bet we bled all of you at one point. Well, you don't use all of that blood, to be honest. We probably could use smaller tubes, but we had extra blood, so we sort of did an informal sero-survey, and we found some humans with antibodies to anaplasma. So I was looking for the first case. I was ferreting around, and this 67-year-old lady came in my office, and I was sure she had Babesia. I was so sure that Pat Snow and I looked at many slides, and I kept her coming back and bleeding her and looking and looking and looking. No Babesia. Pat Snow, if you remember, worked at the hospital, was a first-class lab tech, first class. She made a lot of us look smarter than we are. Well, she found this morula inside a white blood cell, and we had made the diagnosis. Subsequently, it's become much more easily diagnosed, and of course, of the three tick diseases, probably the easiest one to cure. But it's interesting that it did work through our canine friends. They were the ones that are excellent markers for this. In this case, one of my medical assistants was a vet tech, so we were also changing dressings on a dog with a broken leg. But we always did it in the back room. So I got involved in the eternal battle with the tick. Now, I was always interested. This is George Hull. Some of you may know him. George is married to Diana Hull, who works for me. Diana's worked for me probably the longest consecutively than anybody has. So we are going to have the talking doctors working with her. But her husband is a native, because this always comes up, because Diana, everybody thinks is a native, and she isn't. But George says, I'm a native, 13 generations, we don't get sick. Okay. Then a few days later, bed shaking chills, he was in the hospital, out of work. That's Yiddish at the bottom, and it's sort of, don't ask for what you really don't want. So even the natives get it, as well as us Washoeshores. Now, other interesting problems out here that I've been working on it, tularemia, rabbit fever. It's very interesting. The vineyard has about 10 cases a year, 10 to 15. We don't. We average about a half a case a year. And it's probably because we don't have skunks. Skunks are probably more important in the continuance of this in nature than rabbits. But it's an interesting disease. We had a young man come in with a big, ugly ulcer on his back, and I was sure it was a cancer, but it was late in the day, so I said, I'll take it off tomorrow. Over the night, while I was thinking, it dawned on me that this was ulceral glandular tularemia, probably from a greenhead bite, because he lived in a boat, worked in a boat. So the next day, stuck a needle in a lymph node, and we proved it. Now, the state of Massachusetts would like to have him be on the vineyard, but he wasn't. So it's out there. It's one of the interesting, fortunately, we don't have a lot of cases, but it is an interesting problem. Jamestown Canyon virus. 10% of people who come to the emergency room with a fever without any other cause have this mosquito-borne virus. Fever, headaches. It's not fatal. If you cure it, there is no cure for it, and you're probably not going to meet the King of Sweden on this one. But it's interesting that there was a graduate student and I worked on getting blood and looking for this. The new tick disease. This was originally described in Asiatic Russia, but then we found it out here, and subsequently I've identified at least 3 people that have had it out here, a 2-year-old, an 8-year-old, and an adult. It may account for some of the people that seem to take a little bit longer to get over what appears to be Lyme disease without a rash. You treat it with the same antibiotics, so it's really not one of the horsemen of the apocalypse. But it's interesting that it's out there. There are all kinds of things. Deer tick virus. This was described out here by Sam Telford, 1997. Again, not a horseman of the apocalypse, at least not yet, although there have been several case reports and now a fatality. It is very similar to a virus that's seen in upstate New York, southern Ontario, called Powassan's encephalitis, which is usually carried by the tick of woodchucks. No woodchucks, but it's out here. This is the problem. You've got to get the ticks off. Some projects I'm going to be working on the next year or two, a new test for Lyme, a urine test, working with a guy from Harvard, from MGH, better markers, looking for more tularemia. We have an idea for control methods for Lyme disease, if it gets funded, better understanding of babesial diseases and other mosquito-borne illnesses, like eastern equine encephalitis. Mosquitoes, I go out trapping mosquitoes in the late summer, which is hazardous duty, but we haven't identified it in the last couple of years, but it has been found out here. This is one of my traps out in the hidden forest. So if you see me skulking out there at dusk and dawn, you know what I'm up to. I'm putting these out there. They got lights and a little fan and carbon dioxide generators. I like to always use these slides when I'm talking to medical audiences because I deal with real mice, real problems. They deal with academic rats. I like to hold it over them. I used this slide at a big meeting full of infectious disease people, and since I was not being paid by anybody, I could run wild. I like to use this slide too, because this is an interesting slide. This is one I don't show to people usually. A patient comes in complaining of a tick bite. Well, does the patient have the tick with them? Do you know what kind of tick it is? If you do, you can give him some antibiotics, but if you say, no, we're going to move on. Does he have a rash? Any rash at all, even a little rash? If it's yes, give him some antibiotics. If no, we're going to get to that. Does he look concerned about the tick? Give him some antibiotics. And if you go to no, we'll get to that. Will he come back in 2 years and link every complaint to the tick bite? If it sounds like yes, give him antibiotics. No, we go on to that. Will you become the poster child for chronic Lyme disease and the doctors who won't treat it? That's a very real group. If you're worried about that, yes, give them some antibiotics. Or you could say, no, I'm naive, and don't worry about that. If the patient wants you to explain the physiology, life cycle, genus, and evolution of Borrelia burgdorferi, give them some antibiotics. And if it's no, we'll get to that. Is the patient still convinced he may get Lyme disease? Yes, give him antibiotics, or no. Now, if you say no, if you answer any of them that, why don't you just give your receptionist a prescription, because within 24 to 48 hours, they will be back. This doesn't always hold. I don't tend to practice that way, but it can evolve to that. So now we're going to go on to the next ghost, ghosts of the present. I think you'll notice that we've had an increase in mid-level providers at the hospital, and I think we're going to see that. We've seen additions of Dr. Kohler, Dr. Steinmuller, Dr. Duncan, Dr. Lorison, Dr. Frabel. I think if you look at the medical staff now as compared to 1982, the women outvote us, and not by a small amount. I think that is a very interesting change. The bigger change has been the arrival of Mass General. And the reasons for their arrival, as some of you may read the Globe, may not be entirely altruistic. By virtue of picking up Nantucket Cottage Hospital, the Rural Wage Index afforded all of the hospitals in Massachusetts an extra $250 million. Now, in reimbursements, the problem is that came from other states. And the other states would like to sink this little island because of that. Other physicians been here. Dr. Voorhees passed away. Ted LaRochelle passed away. Greg, Craig, Barbara Fenton, whose office I inherited, and Dr. Rosen. I tend to be a burr under the saddle of administration. Margot has done a tremendous job since taking the position. We actually have somebody there that can walk and chew gum, if I dare say that, and who understands the problems of medicine. This was their strategic plan. And this is verbatim. Focus on expand service needed, not necessarily wanted by the various constituencies in the community. Well, I took the hospital to task on that, and I said, what are you talking about? If the constituencies want something, I think we really have to answer this. This is a service business. I think the physical plant is another issue. I have brought this up to the trustees that it's vaguely reminiscent of Cedar Junction. Again, Margot has changed that, but if you go back 5 years, the comparisons are really quite remarkable. And as I said, it's difficult to attract the carriage trade when you're going to put them in the barn. The rooms need to be upgraded, cleaned, and painted. Dr. Pearl went insane on this. She would drag the administrators up, and she would do the white glove test, and it never passed. And the decor 5 years ago was very reminiscent of Soviet interior decorating. Margot has improved that. I will say we've had a change. Now, the change with the general is sort of like the mating of a Great Dane and a Basset Hound. And I actually found a picture of a Great Dane and a Basset Hound. Not mating, but who knows, this could be foreplay. So there's a certain amount of maneuvering necessary for success, and it may be somewhat uncomfortable for each partner. That's what's going on. And Dr. Hartman, bless her soul, has been a great facilitator in the process, sticking up for us in the face of the behemoth. Mass General is not malevolent. It's not the devil. It's just clumsy, big and clumsy. After all, they've been in business 100 years longer than we have. They were founded in 1811. The problem was that their last addressing of small hospital problems and issues was before the Civil War. Margot has been unrelenting in pointing out the issues and calling them up to task. When they sneeze, we catch cold. They have brought financial stability to the hospital. The affiliation is not perfect, and I think they recognize it, and I certainly remind them every chance I can, but it's improving. Now, why, as you may know, it's always good to show a rash. Why didn't I go with Mass General? Because I'm the only non-affiliated Mass General physician. Well, first, I chafe under authority. I'm like Groucho, you know, I wouldn't join any club that'd have me. And surgeons are imbued with a certain amount of hubris, and we don't like to answer to other authority. It's sort of a merit badge for us. I really felt I would lose control of my office staff, control of my practice. And that's very important to me. All of these people are people that I hired, that answer to me, that work for me. They're wonderful people, kids, Shane and Carly, Scary McNary, Diana. Now, I don't have a lot of other pictures because they hide when I bring out the camera. You have to remember, I am a solo surgeon in private practice, sort of like the ivory-billed woodpecker, much talked about but very seldom seen, and probably about to become extinct. There are pluses to going with Mass General. It's a wonderful place. I just don't want to. Now, the future. Talking about the future, I'm going to keep running for school committee. More rashes. This is the ghost of the future. And what does the future hold for us? I think that it's very unclear with Obamacare and the MGH affiliation how the landscape is going to change. There's always going to be a hospital out here. There has to be, at least as long as we're here and we're not moving. The model is the question. Now, there are a variety of things when you start talking about where the future is going to go. First, the plant. Okay, Margot has put lipstick on a pig, okay? And the pig is still a pig. The plant is going to have to change. We are extremely expensive to heat, extremely expensive to keep clean, extremely expensive for the work we do. It's very disproportionate. It's a great hospital for 1957. In 2013, it doesn't work. So Margot will be hitting up all of you. You will cost you money to leave today. But we do need a new hospital. The plan is part of it, and Margot and the architects and the hospital and the physicians have been working to try and find something that works. We'll see what the HDC says, since it doesn't seem to have shingles, at least in the drawings I've seen. But the plan is going to change. The other thing is the people. The people are the important issue. And I think we're going to see changes. I think that within the next 10 years, I'll be almost 80 then, we'll be seeing a group practice on Nantucket. And I think in a way that's something we've always really needed. How it works out, I'm not quite sure. But I think you're going to be seeing a group practice, so you won't have to go to the emergency room on the weekends. I usually give people my phone, but sometimes they don't call. And the emergency room is not an effective alternative to having a physician that is at least familiar with you available. So I think we're going to see a group practice. I think probably the makeup is going to be along the same lines we have, with an internist, some family practice docs, a surgeon, and I think that's the way we're heading. I think we have to be careful, though, that we preserve the soul of the idea that led to the foundation of the hospital in 1911, to provide excellent quality care on Nantucket, and to do it in a way that's cost-effective and reasonable. I think we're going to see more telemedicine. I will tell you that teledermatology at the hospital works pretty well. Telestroke, not so well, okay? It is a great idea. I have seen it work, but I've also seen times when the cameras won't work, or we can't talk to that one or this one. Telepediatrics, I think the island has always asked for a pediatrician. There has been a certain amount of pushback from the family practice folks. I think telepediatrics is probably something we'll see. Telepsychiatry, because mental health issues are not addressed on this island appropriately. I think that's something we're going to see. I want to remind you that the local docs did not all get dumb coming over in the ferry. That is some of the response we do get when we call Boston, Mass General, or the Brigham, or the BI, or BMC, or Tufts. They all think we're sort of stupid. We're the LMDs, local medical docs, from, the great unwashed. I just want to say that I'm not dying. I'm not retiring. You will see where I live, the red arrow, and where the hospital is, the blue arrow. That's not going to change. And I am going to continue working with my dog by my side. And I'm not quite going off into the sunset. I'm more or less seeing the rainbows. And that's all. And I'll take any questions you got. I thought this would be more fun than haranguing you about shooting more deer. Has anybody got any questions? One fallout from the book was my son's in-laws did not know he had been arrested twice. And so it was sort of an unfortunate Christmas present for them. But he was already married, so they couldn't do anything about it. Sure. I have seen a pilot written. It's set in Seattle. I have 2 children. My wife, who is named Kathy with a C, is dead. So it's very different. I don't know. Somebody handsome.
As Nantucket is an isolated community, being an island, have you been involved in any studies or experiences such as Antarctica or even the space station where telemedicine is used to deal with medicine from an isolated perspective, gaining the insight of people farther away?
Well, no, yes, we do that. I mean, we do that on an informal basis, okay? Because usually the problem we run into is if a patient is going to require a high level of care, we really can't do that and we shouldn't do it. So those patients are going to end up in Boston. But certainly on a daily basis, I'm usually talking to somebody in Boston at one of the hospitals about a question on a patient I have, an appropriate way to go. So yes, do we need something more like telemedicine? Yes. And I think that this is a technology that's coming along. Certainly teleradiology. I mean, there was this horrible story about these residents in radiology programs being kicked out because the program shut down because all of a sudden you got the people in Australia are awake when we're asleep, and they can look at the x-rays just as well there as here. So I think that these are changes that we're going to see, more access to that on a real-time basis as opposed to just consults over the phone.